Welcome, everybody, to the 14th Peace Roundtable, sponsored by the American University in Moscow. And very, very happy that we're going to be joined by some exceptional speakers, as always. The world has given us a lot to talk about. The future is certainly underdetermined. There's a lot of potential for good or for bad, as has been the theme of each of the 14 broadcasts we've done up until this point, and I'm sure that will continue to be the theme going forward in the future weeks ahead. We have had some interesting dynamics, disruptive for good and for bad as well, regarding some certain agreements on March 24th in Saudi Arabia that we're going to talk about today. And I'm very curious to get Peter, Professor Hall, and especially Ed's take on that. But this is going to fuel some discussion as well, pertaining to creating a bit some peace corridors, as they say, in the Black Sea. Kiev even kind of gave some lip service to it, but then again, actions speak louder than words, and we've seen a lot of efforts to undermine even this little tiny meager effort towards sanity. So this is one point. There's a lot of other points of concern. Yemen, an escalation of rhetoric in the Pacific, which we might want to talk about at some point. But obviously, the effort to de-escalate the danger of World War III on the Ukraine front has been a primary focus of all of these meetings. So I'm sure that's going to come in. Ed had sent me a couple of clips, or especially a clip by Aaron Mate, which I think might be a good point to start to fuel some fires of discussion. I also have a little 3-minute excerpt from a clip by Sergey Lavrov that I found to be pretty useful, which we might play. There's a bunch of people in the waiting room. I should just let them in here. Yeah, sorry. So without further ado, Ed, what do you think? Would you like me to play Lavrov first or Aaron Mate first? What do you think is the wisest thing?
Aaron Mate, I think, would be good because he has a good summary.
Aaron Mate, okay. So we're going to listen to a 4-minute clip from the end of a very short exposition by Aaron Mate. The entire clip, which is 10 minutes long, will be in the description box in this video, under this video, for those who would like to watch it. But he does a very good condensed summary of what brought us to this crisis, which we'll just listen to the last little bit of it now. So I'll do a screen share.
Victoria Nuland of the State Department, Senators John McCain and Chris Murphy were among those to fly to the Maidan and cavort around with Tiana Buk and other fascist leaders around the Maidan. McCain and Murphy openly talked about bringing about a transition, and when that transition was finally achieved with Yanukovych's ouster, Murphy took credit. He said that it was our role, in part, that helped lead to this change in regime. What was that role? Well, we know from the infamous intercepted phone call between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piet that the U.S. was helping to pick which leaders from the Maidan should join the new government. This reflected the key influence that the U.S. had won by spending millions of dollars via USAID, the NED, and U.S.-friendly billionaires. Accordingly, when the fascist elements of the Maidan sabotaged a power-sharing agreement that had been negotiated by fellow Maidan members that would have left Yanukovych briefly in power, the Obama administration forgot that it had supported the power-sharing agreement and immediately recognized the new coup government that overthrew Yanukovych. What happened after that? The new coup government turned its focus on Ukraine's ethnic Russian population, effectively trying to ban the Russian language and tolerating deadly assaults on ethnic Russians, including in Odessa. In response, Eastern Ukrainians launched an armed rebellion with Moscow's support. The Kremlin meanwhile seized Crimea, which hosted its most important naval base. How did the U.S. respond to this? By encouraging more violence. April 2014, John Brennan goes to Kyiv, tells the Ukrainian government, hey, you should launch an operation against the Donbass, we'll back you up. That's exactly what Ukraine did one day later. Russia then ramped up its support for the rebels, finally militarily intervening directly in August 2014. This fighting leads to the Minsk Accords, which was premised on Ukraine agreeing to recognize limited autonomy for the Donbass, and the rebels would disarm. Well, again, two powerful constituencies ignored this. Ukraine's ultranationalists, who implemented what the Ukrainian-American journalist Lev Golinkin calls a policy of veto through violence. Every time the Ukrainian government took steps to implement Minsk, the Ukrainian fascists held violent protests. And they were joined in their opposition by powerful U.S. officials. Victoria Nuland privately schemed to undermine Minsk. William Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine at the time, told Volodymyr Zelensky, who had been elected on a platform of peace, that implementing Minsk is, quote, a terrible idea. When Biden took power, Zelensky was encouraged to be more belligerent, culminating in the days before Russia's invasion when Zelensky's government was openly saying, forget Minsk, we're never going to implement it. Now, when Russia invaded, that forced Zelensky into his rejection of Minsk, and you had peace talks, culminating in the Istanbul Accords of April 2022. We know there that there was a deal almost reached. That's because Ukrainians told us that. Alexander Chaly, a senior member of the Ukrainian delegation, said this: we managed to find a very real compromise. What would happen to the compromise? Boris Johnson came over to Kyiv on behalf of the U.S. and told Zelensky that he would not be backed up if he made a peace deal with Russia. Now, on top of sabotaging peace opportunities like the Minsk Accords and the Istanbul Accords, and also expanding NATO to Russia's borders, these dangers have been compounded by the U.S. systematically dismantling arms control treaties, most significantly the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty. No longer constrained by such agreements, the U.S. has placed advanced weapon systems closer to Russian territory, all while ramping up military exercises, naval activity. Russia tried to address these issues in its December 2021 proposal to the U.S. and NATO, which was effectively rejected. So, in conclusion, by expanding NATO, ignoring the warnings of high-level Western officials, dismantling arms control, meddling in Ukraine's government, building up CIA bases inside of Ukraine, and finally blocking a diplomatic settlement multiple times, the U.S. and NATO have absolutely provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's finally time to put an end to this carnage and embrace the peaceful alternatives that have long been undermined. Thank you.
We'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Okay, so that was, I think, a pretty potent use of 4 minutes by Aaron Mate. I appreciated that, and I think your choice was correct to start with that. We are, though, still at a point of irresolution. There seems to be some authentic efforts being put into motion that we're seeing, but many analysts are saying that the efforts to even have this ceasefire deal were almost designed to fail, that there's no way that Kiev and the masters, the handlers of Zelensky, were going to allow this to go forward. We're already seeing attacks onto Russian critical energy infrastructure and other things using drones to really just show a certain dishonesty. There's a lot of belligerence in the language of leaders, especially in France and England, that could get very messy. So this is going to be one of the core topics. And Ed, I don't know, I'd like to get your thoughts before we jump on to Peter and Hall and others. Where do you think we're at right now?
But I think we better just finish because you have 2 more pieces, right?
Oh,
So
I was going to splice it in later on. I just have one more from Lavrov right now.
Yeah, let's do Lavrov then. And then
Yeah, straight. Okay, sure. Let's do Lavrov. All right, a word from Mr. Lavrov himself, and then we'll jump into it. Okay. And hopefully this is a little bit more easy to work. There it is. Okay. Can people see that screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not about a piece of land, but about the people who live there and who have expressed themselves in favor of their future being connected with the Russian Federation. And it's about the fact that I need to supply weapons there on all 3 points. Firstly, Zelensky himself, after being rude to Trump in the White House, then went to London, where he was welcomed warmly. And upon returning to Kyiv, he began making even more bold statements, including rejecting a neutral status and rejecting the discussion of territory. No, give us everything. Give us everything. What does that mean? That you have banned everything Russian, including the canonical Orthodox Church, Ukrainian, which is a sister to the Russian Orthodox Church, including the media, including education. Now there's a new bill in the Rada to prohibit speaking Russian during school breaks. Previously, it was only during lessons. And what they want to return citizens to this country who, in the referendum, simply said we are Russian, and if we lived with all our rights, we would be Russian citizens of Ukraine. And you are trying to exterminate us both physically and legally. And in this situation, by the way, it turns out that Europe not only shows an affront towards the analysis of Trump and his team, but also that territories without NATO need to be discussed and resolved. But Europe also wants to provoke Zelensky himself, because when they talk about these peacekeeping or security forces, the point is that at least the part that is currently controlled by the Kyiv regime, or that will be controlled, at the moment of some kind of agreement, it needs to be urgently taken under control by themselves, by the British, by the French. And no one is talking about the fact that in this part of Ukraine, well, in the rest of Ukraine, which will return to its native harbor, has returned there. The rights of all Russians and national minorities in terms of language, education, and culture are fully ensured. But when the rest of Ukraine, if it indeed remains in some form, is taken under control by the security forces of NATO countries, it doesn't matter under which flag. No one is saying, and then we will strengthen democracy in the remaining territory. We will abolish racist laws, Russophobic ones, that eradicate everything Russian. No one is talking about this. And if so, it means these security forces will be perpetuating the Nazi regime with a ban on everything that somehow reminds of Russian roots. Of this country, which in fact came into existence thanks to the Russians.
I appreciate that final irony at the end, that the very existence of Ukraine as a state wouldn't exist were it not for the Russians. But that being said.
Yeah, well, let's now move to Washington.
Yes.
We have Peter Kuznick here, who is following those things. And I think he, looking at what his schedule, he hardly sleeps at all. He's all over. He's giving interviews to China media, India, Russian media, and of course, American media and us. So, Peter, say a few words. What do you think about the whole thing that we just watched a couple of moments?
Well, and actually, I've got an interview in India in 40 minutes. But I'm not going to take 40 minutes. Don't get worried. What I'd said to you earlier was Ed and I both spoke at a conference in Russia 2 days ago on the 80th anniversary of Yalta. So I suggested to Ed when he asked me to speak today that I would talk about the lessons of Yalta, as I did with our Russian colleagues. And it was an interesting event. The session that we were on, the first speaker was Steven Seagal, the actor. Then I spoke. No, the first speaker was Roger Waters, the founder of Pink Floyd. And then I spoke, and then Steven Seagal, and then Ed. So it was a rather strange thing. But rather than just talking about the current thing, I wanted to put it in a little more different context, which might not be what people want to hear today. But Yalta has lessons that I think are very pertinent that we need to think about now. Because when we went into Yalta, it's a celebration of the unity of the Americans, the Russians, and the Brits in 1945. The meeting in Yalta was the second of the three big international conferences. And at that meeting, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill laid out a very progressive and hopeful vision for the world. But they had very different interests coming into this. The Brits wanted everybody wanted to defeat the Germans and the Japanese, but the Brits wanted to maintain the British Empire at all costs. The Russians were obsessed with security. They've been invaded over and over again through Eastern Europe in the preceding decades. And as Harriman says, Russia is obsessed with security. And that to them meant they wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, especially between themselves and Germany. And the Americans wanted a United Nations to maintain peace after the war, but they also wanted a world that would be penetrated by American capital, that America will have complete access to. And the responses to the conference were ebullient, effusive. The New York Times headlined this coverage, Moscow jubilant over Big Three Accord. Roosevelt, although he was near death already, when he came back exhausted and depleted and couldn't stand when he gave his speech to the Congress, said the Conference of the Crimea was a turning point, I hope, in our history, and therefore in the history of the world. We shall have to take responsibility for world collaboration, or we shall have to bear the responsibility for another world conflict. And I'm confident the Congress, the American people, will accept the results of the conference as the beginning of a permanent structure of peace upon which our children and grandchildren, yours and mine, the children and grandchildren of the whole world must live and can live. And that, my friends, the only message I can give you, for I feel very deeply. I know that all of you are feeling it today and are going to feel it in the future. I could go on and on with the various responses that were effusive and hopeful and forward-looking, but and this was an attempt to make up for the earlier tensions. When the U.S. promised to open up a second front in Europe before the end of 1942, promised to Molotov and Stalin, and then Churchill blocked it and reneged on the agreement, and the Russians were in a position, the Soviets were in a position, as a result, throughout most of the war, of confronting 200 German divisions or more, while the U.S. and the Brits confronted only 10 between us. You know, the diplomatically and militarily, the Soviets almost single-handedly defeated the Germans, while the U.S. The U.S. got involved in Operation Torch in North Africa, which General Marshall demeaned as periphery pecking. And Eisenhower said the day we invade North Africa instead of Europe will be the blackest day in American history. As a result of that, America dallying there and defending British imperial interests, the Soviets, as we know, lost 27 million people. The United States lost 400,000 people in World War II, but the Soviets lost 27 million. And when my students, in order to try to get them to conceptualize that, I tell them that's the equivalent numerically of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. You know, it's very hard to get our heads around what this meant. Or as Kennedy said in his AU commencement address, it's the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago being destroyed. And so, but now the Europeans, only 13% of Europeans say that Russia played a major role in defeating Germany. In France, in 1945, 57% of the French said Russia was the main force in defeating Nazi Germany. Now, 7% of the French even think that Russia played a major role. So what I talked about was the fact that the facts on the ground, with Russia and the Soviets occupying Eastern and Central Europe, put Roosevelt in a position where he had little bargaining power at Yalta. Roosevelt was later accused of being a traitor, having sold the Western interests out to Stalin at Yalta. Well, Roosevelt did not give anything away that the Soviets either did not already control, or that the Soviets could not exert control over. So if we look at the agreements to change the borders in Poland, the agreement on the liberated Europe, the other agreements, clearly Roosevelt did not have a strong hand to play there. He had said at Tehran at the earlier meeting that he would not agree to anything in terms of Poland that is in any way inimical to Soviet interests there. And he followed through on that. As he said to Admiral Leahy, he said, Leahy said that the agreement is so elastic that the Russians could stretch it all the way from Yalta to Washington without ever technically breaking it. Roosevelt replied, I know, Bill, I know, but it's the best I could do for Poland at this time. So they gave the toast. They were drinking lots of vodka and lots of champagne and started toasting heartily. And Roosevelt toasted to the future, and Stalin cautioned. And he said, it's not so difficult to keep unity in time of war since there is a joint aim to defeat the common enemy, which is clear to everyone. The difficult task will come after the war, when the diverse interests will intend to divide the Allies. It's our duty to see that our relations in peacetime are as strong as they have been in war. And Roosevelt stuck to that. However, what I go on and to talk about at length that I won't do now is that there were two major factors that were going to undermine this hopefulness. Roosevelt's last cable to Churchill before he died said, "I would minimize the general Soviet problem as much as possible because these problems, one form or another, seem to arise every day and most of them straighten out." Well, if Roosevelt had lived longer, or if his previous vice president, Henry Wallace, had become president instead of Harry Truman, we could have had an enduring peace. Now, people don't know very well the Wallace story, but Wallace was vice president from 41 to 45. And he should have become vice president in 44 when the Democratic Convention met in Chicago on July 20th, 1944. Gallup issued a poll asking potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% said they wanted Henry Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. Well, that was one of the history's tragedies, that Wallace lost the nomination because the party bosses controlled the convention and because Roosevelt was too weak to fight for him the way he had in 1940. And Truman listened to Stettinius and Harriman and Jimmy Burns and the other anti-Soviet hardliners, and we saw what happened. Had Roosevelt lived or Wallace been vice president, had Wallace become president on April 12, 45, instead of Truman, there would have definitely been no atomic bombings in World War II and almost certainly no Cold War. But the danger is, and one of the points I stress, is that going forward, what we need is leadership. We need visionary leadership, not of the Harry Truman sort, not of the sort that used atomic bombs in 1945, even though 7 of America's 8 five-star admirals and generals were opposed to it. And the 8th Marshal said that the Soviet invasion might leverage the Japanese surrender by itself. And that really set the heads of the Russian leaders spinning in Moscow because they knew there was no excuse for American use of the bombs. And they interpreted exactly as intended as a warning to Russia. If Russia interfered with America's plans in Europe or the Pacific, they were going to get this and worse, much worse. So Eisenhower was in Moscow when he learned the atomic bombings, and he said, up to this point, I was sure we'd maintain peace, but now I don't know if it's possible anymore. So one point that I wanted to stress is that the question of leadership is crucial. We need leaders who speak for the world, who see them globally, not in terms of their own parochial nationalism, as almost all the leaders do today. The second point I wanted to make is that facts on the ground are not sufficient. Right now, Russia is on the offensive. Right now, Russia is taking more in the Sumy region. Russia is rolling over Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the country. They've driven Ukrainians out of Kursk. The same thing happened after World War II. Facts on the ground said that the Soviets had control over most of Europe and that the West would have to accept Russia's positions. What we need now is something more visionary that we didn't have after World War II, after Roosevelt died and Wallace was out of the picture. And we need to have a settlement here that's going to represent and reflect the kind of international global security structure that reflects everybody's enduring national security interests going forward if we're going to have a peaceful world. And what we see now, what concerns me, and I look what Hegseth and others have said in this administration, and that's that they want to end the war in Ukraine so they can go after America's real enemy, which is China. And Matt mentioned before about some of the latest developments in China. Where is Hegseth now? He's in the Philippines. What's he doing? Again, making war plans toward China. If you look at the statements by Admiral Davidson, by General Mike Minihan, by General Buchanan, they're all talking about war with China. And I go back to the uh, two articles on August 20th, one in the New York Times by David Sanger, saying the U.S. is preparing to fight a three-front nuclear war simultaneously against Russia, China, and North Korea. And that same day, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had a very important article saying that some of the top advisors around Trump believe the United States can fight and win a nuclear war. This gets back to the thinking that we had during the first Trump administration. This is insanity. And the insanity, we see what's happening now, not only with the Europeans, now they're talking about a reassurance force. Okay, they dropped it from a peacekeeping force, now it's a reassurance force, which they say they can't even do that. The Europeans are fractured now. You've got the Brits and the French pushing ahead with their plans not to militarily get involved and to back Ukraine to the hilt militarily, doing everything they can to undermine a peace agreement at this point. And with Macron offering to extend a French nuclear umbrella, to, and Merz likes that idea. And Tusk in Poland has said that the Poles should have access to nuclear weapons also. What I'm afraid of is we're on the verge of nuclear anarchy. The United States has just sent another aircraft carrier strike group to Southwest Asia. The USS Vinson is joining the USS Harry Truman. We've sent more B-2 stealth bombers to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. A lot of people are seriously concerned now that Trump, with his unfettered support for Israel, is looking toward the war with Iran. Again, more madness. And the attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, what does Trump say? He says that Iran is responsible for everything the Houthis do. And so we're sending these forces into the region. And my fear, and a lot of other people's fear, is that the U.S. is going to use that as an opportunity that Netanyahu's been urging for a long time to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities. If they do that, and they could probably only do it with use of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons at this point, if they do that, then Iran, when its first chance it has, will race for a bomb. If Iran develops a nuclear bomb, then we're going to see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Turkey also going nuclear. In South Korea, 73% of the population says South Korea should develop its own nuclear weapons. There are forces in Taiwan calling for Taiwan to have nuclear weapons. Ishiba, before he became the prime minister of Japan, said Japan should either have access to or its own nuclear weapons. And we know how massive their control of plutonium is. So what concerns me now, and I know this is not exactly what Ed wanted and Matt wanted to talk about, but what concerns me now is that even if we do somehow, which I think is still a real long shot, get a settlement in Ukraine, the rest of the world is going mad in a terribly dangerous way. And what we have to be thinking about is not just Ukraine, it's the entire global system. We have to get a global security architecture that reflects everybody's interests so we can resolve issues peacefully. And we have to stop this current drive for nuclear anarchy, which will doom us all if that ever happens. Anyway, so I'd be happy to go into more detail on the other things, but I wanted to talk about this to try to set a broader agenda.
Yeah, no, I completely endorse and appreciate what you did, because the world, it's a global chemistry. It's not a kinetic thing between two or two and a half powers like we often hear discussed. So, the fact that there is this broader momentum to refocus attention towards China explicitly and also Iran secondarily by figures who are otherwise saying some good things on the Russia front should not be ignored.
And on the nuclear front, Trump.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And it's insane what we're doing on nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he's pushing for the confrontations that could make nuclear weapons so much more usable.
Absolutely. No, if we don't talk about it, we can't do anything about it. So, and what Putin has also said in his recent Murmansk address, I thought was pretty useful at reflecting some of the spirit, at the very least, of of Yalta and the general idea of bringing the UN back to its original foundation as giving it its original mandate as a peacemaking player, along with other neutral countries, however that would work. I'd be curious to know what I know that Colm, Marty, Hall are waiting to say a few words, and I'm curious to see what these guys have to say about some of this and the practicality of Putin's call. Ed, who would you like
Yes,
to, who do you think would do well to speak
yeah.
next?
So before we go into the next speaker,
Yeah.
I want to ask Peter, first of all, thank him for this really great historical perspective. But I want to ask him if he sees in America the names, give us the names, because he mentioned Wallace during the Roosevelt time. Do you see the guy here or woman who can lead us to this peaceful future? Do you see any names, specific names?
In the United States, I don't know
Yes.
if there's been anybody since the last year of Kennedy. You know, I've been doing a lot of interviews about the Kennedy files, the JFK files that were released. I don't, I wish I did. And do you have any suggestions of somebody in the US who's got a vision? So actually somebody mentions Tulsi there, you know, and I'm a big fan of Tulsi because when the New York Times interviewed her, did a big profile on her in 2019, they asked her what podcast she watched. She said, I don't want to talk about podcasts. I just finished watching and reading The Untold History of the United States by Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick, and I think it's great, and everybody should read this to find out the history they don't know. So I'm a big fan of Tulsi's, but when it comes to the Israel and Gaza and Iran, she's as bad as the others. So even though she's a voice of reason on Ukraine and some of the other concerns, she's not universally a positive force at this point.
Yeah, Tulsi also actually is my choice because we don't have any other names. But let's see, maybe someone will appear on stage. Okay, so Matt, I think is Hall.
Yeah, I think we promised Hall the next platform.
Yeah.
So Hall, are you still there? Mr. Gardner,
Yeah,
you're
I'm
on mute. There you are.
I'm here. I got myself here. Can you see me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I heard so much. I don't know how to respond to everything there. I can simply say one, the Henry Wallace strain of American foreign policy was pretty much destroyed with Wallace. It never really came back. You had hope in people like Fulbright and others who were against the Vietnam War. Of course, but then Biden became senator of my state for opposing the war, and look what his record has been since his first opposition to Vietnam way back in the 70s that brought him to power, senator for almost ever in Delaware, and what a disaster as a president. I'm sorry, I voted for him, but but anyway. So I'm afraid I don't see any American leadership right now that really has the global vision of the disaster that we've been walking into since the 90s, since the Clinton administration pushed for NATO enlargement. It was clear at that time in as early as 95 that the push for NATO enlargement would create a backlash from Russia. It would divide NATO. It would ultimately be an expensive, super expensive cost once the Russians backlash. But the Clinton administration played all those points down, pushed for NATO enlargement, even though, as I've said before here, George Kennan, Paul Nitze, the very founders of containment, opposed NATO enlargement. Almost every NATO supreme commander opposed NATO enlargement. They all supported the Partnership for Peace. It was a viable alternative to NATO enlargement. Moving forward, the immediate situation that Biden was pushing for or claiming that Ukraine should join NATO, knowing full well it would never join NATO. This has been the hypocritical stance of the American politics for ever since 2008. Even though Ukraine was secretly on the list to join NATO around 1994. It became more public when Congress started pushing for Ukraine to join NATO, along with almost all the other states, including Moldova and others, in the early 96 documentation of Congress's push for NATO enlargement. But right before we were back, certainly the Donbass area was a crucial reason for the Russian backlash and attack, but also was what nobody seems to be mentioning. It was the August 23, 2021 Crimea platform, where Zelensky was getting international finance support, multiple governments supporting what Zelensky called the peaceful retaking or regaining of Crimea. And I think that was another factor that caused the Russian backlash, where having taken the Crimea in 2014, in the fear that NATO would deploy bases or missile defense systems in Crimea, the fear that Crimea would continue and gain funds, and we know the CIA and all, they were quietly building up Ukrainian military capability since 2014, if not before. So those are the factors I think that led Russia to intervene. And I divide this between the sins of omission and the sins of commission. Russia has committed a sin of commission by invading Ukraine. But the real problem was the sin of omission. It was clear, as I just said, since mid-90s, that Russia would back us. Yeltsin warned, Gorbachev warned, Yeltsin warned. You can go down the list of Russians that warned. American leaders I just mentioned warned. This could have been prevented with sane diplomacy in which our leaders would have a vision of how to bring a new system of European security to Europe that would include the Russians, not exclude them. William Perry, the defense minister at the time, said you can't expand NATO, American defense minister in the 90s, you can't expand NATO without and expect the Russians not to react. You had to include them in the process of building a new Europe. So the next point here is that having done this, the war has begun. Now the question is Putin Bismarck or is Putin Hitler? The propagandists are saying he's Hitler, that he's going to take over all of Europe, and this is creating a real war scare in Europe. The Europeans are already putting together a new joint civilian military preparedness and readiness measures in order to prepare for the possibility of a Russian invasion. But it's not just the Russian invasion they're worried about. They want to be able to rapidly respond to geopolitical threats and conflicts near the borders, as implied by the Russian threat, but also cybersecurity threats, climate change, and natural hazards. We're seeing incredible the climate denial. I don't know how anybody can be a climate skeptic these days. Climate change is impacting Europe. It's impacting the United States. And also, of course, future pandemics. The Europeans are preparing for these crises, but the main thrust of their approach is the Hitler effect, the Hitler analogy that Russia will at some point invade Europe. And I really don't think Russia has any interest in taking the war beyond Ukrainian borders. But that's the bogeyman the Europeans are using to boost defense spending, talking about an 800 billion defense fund in order to ramp up European defenses, and it's to be used to centralize European defense measures, to build up what they call a coalition of the willing that are able to engage in conflicts outside of Europe while also defending Europe. The French are, as Peter already mentioned, are talking about a French nuclear umbrella over all of Europe, expanding it. Some French politicians are saying that French nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads should move from about 280 to 300 to 1,000 over the next few years. The French are talking about deploying their nuclear-capable Rafale fighter jet in Germany. And this is all creating tensions behind the scenes at the same time that the U.S. under Biden has talked about deploying intermediate-range missiles in Germany that would first be American and then be taken over by the Europeans at a longer range. And I haven't seen the Trump administration say anything against that at the moment. I could be wrong. Maybe they've discussed it, but I don't see it. On the other hand, as we just saw, HEGSEF in the Philippines, and they're putting launching systems there that are capable of striking China, or that will have the capabilities to strike China. So those two factors, to me, create this warmongering effect of pushing Russia, even China, closer together, despite the fact that we're talking about peace in Ukraine. So, in my view, if Putin is Bismarck, he will not go any further than. To me, it's clear that he wants to take Kursk. I couldn't believe he would make any settlement without taking Kursk, and I don't think he'll push too far. If he wants a settlement, he won't push too farther than Podolsk, where the intersection of the different Donbass regions link the different transport routes in that region there. He might push farther. I think he would be foolish, and I don't think it's in the Russian interest to push to Odessa. I think that would it would ironically perhaps be it's not in the Russian interest to try to leave Ukraine landlocked. I really don't think they want an unstable Ukraine that they couldn't control on their borders. And so I think the Russians have to think where they're going to end. As I said, if he's Bismarck did not take all of Alsace-Lorraine. He took a good amount of it in the 1870-71 war. And war between France and Germany, it took another 30 years to 40 years before it developed, before it broke out. Well, that's a long historical debate, and one that differs a bit from the perspective that Peter was talking about earlier. But the last point here, I think, is the fact that I think a peace is possible. It cannot be done with this French. If the French and Brits want to create a new force capabilities, they can do that behind the scenes, but not on Ukrainian territory. The idea of a UN or OSCE-backed forces, neutral forces. I've been pushing this for a long time. Neutral forces in Ukraine as peacekeeping forces. If you put forces from India, South Africa, Brazil, the BRICS countries, why would Russia attack those forces if they're deployed for peaceful purposes in assuring the lines that no one crosses the lines of demarcation? Ukraine has to announce that it will remain neutral in those conditions. But as I said, if the Europeans and in the US want to back up Ukraine in the background, I see no problem with that. The problem is to create a space where the two sides can begin to calm down, reduce tensions, and then create, and this is where I pick up from what Peter was arguing, we can't just stop there. We have to move forward to a new settlement of European security that would go beyond peace in the Ukraine and towards dealing with the new NATO expansion in the Baltic states, Finland and Sweden, and create a new interaction between Russia, US, European, NATO in those areas as well. And I'm thinking specifically of Kaliningrad, which is a flashpoint of potential war in the future. The Russians have put nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad. This is one of the, at least the Americans have accused them of that. If that's true, this is creating more and more tensions in the north of Europe, and that those weapons have to disappear, but they won't disappear until NATO begins to back off from its threats to Russia and the Murmansk and the other nuclear facilities inside Russia. So what I'm saying here is that we need peace talks that not only engage with Ukraine, but also the flashpoint of Kaliningrad, the tensions that are inside the Russian communities inside Estonia and the other Baltic states. We need discussions between these groups so that they don't become fifth columns in raising tensions inside Europe. And that's really the issue I think the Europeans are most concerned about. It's not that Russia is going to attack NATO members or NATO directly in Europe. That's the warmongering Hitler analogy. What could be probable is efforts to support sabotage and other activities, cyber attacks, etc., inside Europe. And all those things need to be discussed and brought into these negotiations that bring the US, Europeans, and Russians into a new European security architecture. If that doesn't happen, though, we will see these other, if that doesn't happen, we're going to see the other aspects of this crisis develop in China and other regions. This war will expand further, gradually, step by step, if we don't make the steps now to bring peace with Moscow. So my last point here is if we start making, finding a path, the ceasefire that leads to a general settlement with Ukraine, a neutral Ukraine, international peacekeepers, as I said, they can be from neutral countries. If say Hungary wants to deploy forces, I'm not sure Putin would be upset about that as long as they're part of the UN process. But then what's next step is, as I said, looking at the focal points of tensions in Europe, Kaliningrad being the main one, finding ways to deal with the Russian minorities in the Baltic states, which see themselves as, some of them anyway, see themselves as isolated or discriminated against. Those are elements, and then we have to talk about the Baltic. But then the bigger picture is China and the tensions that are the Trump administration is really accelerating the tensions with China, and it's very dangerous, and Iran.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll end it up there.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Matt.
Yeah, no, I just want to reemphasize what Hall, well, not even reemphasize, but just to add a little bit of coloring to it. It's clear that we definitely need some level-headed adults in the room to step up, and the proposition of neutral states playing a role in helping to sort out and denazify, as well as guarantee a reconstitution of Ukrainian democracy. Not the way the NATO freaks, as I guess not a diplomatic way, but to speak, but I think it's the truthful way. Not the way they're talking about it, but the way Putin outlined it, I think is reasonable. It gives us something to work with as a scaffolding. I don't know how it would work, but Gerald Pechnuk in the chat box did make a point that beyond the formalities of peace treaties, concrete economic cooperation is really important to begin to transform the deep-seated multi-generational antagonisms and neurotic disorders that are capitalized upon. And he made a link here to U.S.-Russia Arctic cooperation discussed at Murmansk. And sure enough, that is something I'm very passionate about. And Putin did make it clear that he sees that the Arctic as a whole as a really strategic, important platform to create some space for learning how to play properly together with some trust building. Since there's a lot of resources, a lot of development potential, Russia and China are already moving heavily on the Polar Silk Road. I haven't seen any collaborative response yet from the American side, mind you. I did see it in Trump's first term, where he passed an executive order in 2020 in September, giving federal support to the building of a rail line from Alberta to Alaska, connecting the lower 48 states, which would have been a really good spark for thinking of the Arctic not from militaristic terms, but from opening up, roads and rail to resources, as well as getting us closer to collaborating with Russia and other Arctic neighbors in a positive way. That would have been good. I haven't seen any of that revived yet. Hopefully we do. Similarly on the space front, I know the Russians have made even some offers to assist Musk in developing some nuclear propulsion systems for deep space exploration. that could be a fun point that could open up a lot of creative modes of dialogue.
If I could just add quickly, Kaliningrad is a perfect hub for trade between Europe and the Polar Silk Road, and the Chinese are interested in that, and they've been trying to develop it. And you just have to link it to Europe. It's a great way to develop the whole region. I've been arguing that for a number of years, but there are ways to start creating trade and positive benefits between Russia, Europe, and in this new polar age we're walking into. Okay, I'll stop it.
No, that's good. It would be so easy. So with that,
so easy, exactly.
let's move over to we've got Marty and Com, who both had some thoughts they wanted to share. We are running short on time because we also have a few questions from audience members. So I'd ask both guys, Marty and Com, to try to do a maximum 10-minute briefing to share your thoughts on what you've just heard and what you're thinking about.
Okay, my sound's up, I take it, Matt?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I fully agree with the assessments of Hall and Peter, and I think Peter's points are hideously depressing, totally accurate, absolutely terrifying. What I'm going to say and try to squeeze in is in the context of that, but I think there's more. Why is an idiot like Starmer and an effeminate little Nancy Boy puppet like Macron showing such courage in defying the United States of America? They are not defying the United States of America. They are defying one man, President Donald Trump, maybe two men, but Vice President Vance as well. I think let's say the political survival in office of the president is highly problematical. And a lot of it is his own fault. Interesting that you already see this, Colm. Thank you. A lot of it is his own fault. He has surrounded himself with these people. Peter has documented it. These lunatics all believe in war with China. Most of them believe in the being able to take on Russia and North Korea at the same time. This is the same delusion that the Poles had in 1939, that they were going to easily smash the Germans, march to Berlin in 6 weeks, and then march to Moscow immediately afterwards and smash the Soviet Union. This was not the view of one or two lunatics and idiots in Warsaw. They were all lunatics and idiots. It was the strategic assessment of the Polish General Staff and of Colonel Beck, the head of the Polish government. They were perfectly open about this at the time. They even thought they were threatening Stalin and Hitler about this. This is the kind of delusion we have now. We are in a very dangerous situation. The way I would read it is this: Russia does not want or plan to attack Western Europe. No, does not want to, but they have planned to because they believe they're being pushed into it. The French denuclearization plans are a major step on this, but the key point holding back war is this: President Putin still respects and hopes for some kind of settlement, at least on Ukraine, with President Trump. If President Trump and Vice President Vance are removed, then the Russian strike will be against Western Europe too, as well as against the United States. That is what we are deadly close to. That's what I have to say.
Yeah, that's sharp. That's a smack of reality. Thank you. Com, I know you've been waiting for a while. Mr. Carpentier, where are you? You're on mute by default, Com, if you're still there.
Right, I am here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. Oui, monsieur.
I wanted to start with a very brief reference to Henry Wallace, because Henry Wallace was a close friend and I would say disciple in some way of Nicholas Roerich. And it's through Roerich, it seems that he got his idea of world peace and particularly agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. So there is a fascinating story there, which I won't go into, but it's interesting to see that all the promoters of a intercontinental peace between Russia or the Soviet Union and the US were defeated. And of course, the most famous example is John Kennedy. I don't know if you recently saw an interview of Daniel Sheehan, the famous attorney and researcher, who has shown how Kennedy was killed by the CIA, particularly by Dulles, because he had exchanged 18 letters with Nikita Khrushchev, asking for peace, which Kennedy publicly defined not as Pax Americana, which is a military domination of the United States, but a real sharing of resources, information, and particularly joint space program, which is what apparently brought about his demise, according to a lot of evidence which has been collected and which is available. So that tells me that what we are dealing with is a very, very dangerous moment in history, because the very party which has eliminated all those who wanted to avoid a global confrontation with at that time the Soviet Union, and now with Russia and China, are the same people who are fighting tooth and nail to prevent Trump from achieving what he wants to do, which is clearly some kind of a partnership with Russia, which would give the US access to enormous natural resources. And Trump rationally sees Russia as a much easier partner with only 160 million people, a vast amount of land, few people, and concerns about Russia's neighbors, such as China. So he sees that as a much more suitable partner than the divided and messy and cantankerous European Union. But unfortunately, the liberal democratic establishment in the US is closely allied with the major European governments, and they are the ones who are doing everything to try to defeat Trump and to prevent a cessation of the war in Ukraine. And as you may have seen, there has been a very serious attempt on the life of Putin in the last few days. And there are reasons to believe that certain Western powers are behind that. And that's their hope, because if they can somehow get rid of Putin, then they think all Trump's plans will evaporate. And of course, here we are looking at a real possibility of World War II, because you are looking at Sarajevo to the power of 10, if you know what I mean by referring to the beginning of World War I. So that is what we have to be very concerned about, because indeed it has been said again and again, Europe has been put on a war mode, and Macron and Starmer are actually betting on that to save their own sinking political fortunes. They think that they have failed as economic leaders, as successful economic leaders, so they are trying now to become successful war leaders, and they are willing to risk a lot to try to unite the country behind them on the grounds that they are fighting for the survival of Europe. So I'm really concerned about the possibility that we might have a major explosion. And we see even countries like Denmark now saying we also want to be present in the Indo-Pacific because Europe has to be there to contain China. So now you have delegations coming to India, where I am, and from Europe saying we want to be here because you see we will need to help you to contain China. So you see the kind of global war mood that is now being propagated. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Yeah. On that note, that sort of demoralizes me a little bit to think about, because I know that in Trump's first term there were certain maneuvers pre-COVID to create a good relationship based on economic cooperation with China. There was a $300 billion trade deal that was later sabotaged. The red carpet was rolled out, and it did seem like there was an effort, as Trump had even said, to have a US, Russia, China leadership to rebuild the world and get off the nuclear war front. So that gave me a lot of hope. Currently, I'm curious, Colm or Marty or Hall, is there anybody in and around Trump's administration right now who is not pushing for an inevitable war with China? Do you see any sane minds that seem to not have fallen for that trap, or I'll add Iran, or is everybody kind of moving in that direction right now?
No, I think there are dissenters, but what's very interesting, and I have this from very good direct sources, the Chinese do not show any real concern about Trump's intentions and threats. Now, you might say Chinese are very good at hiding their real feelings, but I think there is a sense in China that Trump is not in a position to implement the kind of policies he's talking about. And therefore, they believe that it's not going to have a major effect on their economy. We'll see. I mean, at least that seems to be the assessment at the top level of the Chinese leadership for now.
Amen. Hope so. We'll see.
Okay, if I can, just a couple of points.
Yes, sir.
Listening to all those great historical events, and what's happening now. Well, as it happens, the President of the United States now is Donald Trump. And of course, he's saying many stupid things, and some actions are also not very good. But he's the one we have. And at least he's the one who said, I have very good relations with Putin and with Chinese leader Xi. He's saying this. So why not just three of them meet? And I've been pushing this idea for a long time, since his first term. In Washington Times columns and ads, I urged for Yalta 2.0, and the perfect chance is May 9. May 9, it's 80th anniversary of victory of World War II, and this is when we can make history. Trump can make history if he comes to Moscow, and since Xi has already accepted the invitation, he will be there as long as many other leaders. So this will be, then we are now actually starting a movement. It's something that all of you can participate. We have, in advance of May 9th, there's another important date, is Elbury reunion, April 25. So we're assembling to parallel to this group. We have another group now, and I want to merge those two groups. This another group wants to start, let's say, on in preparation on April 12. April 12 is a very important day. It's a space day, first flight by Yuri Gagarin to space. And we know that now space probably is the only cooperation that it still exists with the United States and Russia. Just recently, a few days ago, Russian cosmonaut was together with American cosmonaut going to International Space Station. So we want to appeal to President Trump to come to Moscow, or at least maybe issue some joint statement, but coming to Moscow will be great. And he already talking about he wants to meet Putin. Many times he said it. So why not do it on May 9? And then have, after this parade is over, then they go to some nice Putin's dacha, and then they talk. And maybe in this case, they can resolve all issues, both on Ukrainian front, of course, finalize, and on China as well. So I want to invite everyone. I will send everyone information. First session will be April 12th. We will appeal to Trump to come to Moscow. And then on April 25, we will have a great event in downtown Moscow with a lot of musicians, artists, speakers. We invited new American ambassador to be there. And in the past, on that day, U.S. ambassadors showed up and took part in the celebration for Elbury reunion. And this will be just on the eve of Victory Day celebration on May 9th. All of you are invited. All of you will be invited to sign some kind of appeal or say something. So this is some, well, we will see what happens. Thanks. Okay, Matt, back to you.
Thank you, Ed. And do you anticipate having like a petition or some public appeal that can be printed that everyone can spread, share, and sign soon?
Right. Actually, tomorrow and day after tomorrow, we're going to meet with this group and finalize this text of this appeal, and then send it to everyone. Then we will ask you not only sign by yourself, but spread to your social networks as well. They really have to accumulate like a movement for Yalta 2. It's something that Peter started. It was really great company. You see, can anybody being on the same stage with Roger Waters and Steve Stiegel? This is pretty good.
Ed, I want you to get Steven Seagal to be on the next Peace Roundtable, man. I really, you have to make this happen. That would make my day. All right. Okay. If you're listening, Steven, please, this is a challenge. Come speak to our roundtable.
Scott Ritter, definitely Scott Ritter. I am communicating with him every day, Scott Ritter.
Okay.
He's opening also competing. As you know, I have a group called Russia House. And suddenly Scott Ritter also formed group Russia House. So I suggested that we merge, and he's interested. So
good
Scott
idea.
Ritter, I promised to have one of our next sessions.
Okay, good, great. We have time for a couple of questions. It's a bit late here in Thailand where I am, but we can definitely have a couple of questions. Robert, I've seen you raising your digital hand for a while. Go for it.
Okay, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, I had a relatives who fought in the Second World War, so I'd be very happy to participate in the 80th anniversary, and whether it's actually April 12th, I think is the 80th anniversary of FDR's death, actually, interestingly enough. So I thought that might be interesting in the context, but I'd love to participate in the statement. Also, I liked your piece on the Arctic. That was very good, Ed. What I talked about, I'm actually about to publish a piece in Newsmax dealing with our conversation from 2 weeks ago, dealing with the European institutions. I believe part of the reason Europe is resisting Trump so badly, well, is because a lot of these institutions are undemocratic. The European Commission is way too powerful. There are 27 members. Each of them have a member of the Commission. None of them are elected, and yet they lecture us on Russia on democracy, or even the US on democracy. And yet, so I think just talking about making them elected would be an interesting idea. Obviously, the European Court of Justice, it's very, it doesn't allow national courts and national. And the European Parliament is hammered because they don't have the ability to introduce legislation. Can everyone hear me? Or I don't know if I'm.
Yeah, we can hear you. Just your
Oh,
visuals
good.
cut out, but your audio was always clear.
Okay, well, I hope I'm making some sense then. But yeah, I think that so I that's the institutions that I think so. In the 2 weeks ago, one of the speakers said that what holds Europe together is Russophobia. Well, I would say, how about democracy as a counterweight, and say, call them out on their BS because they're not democratic. They represent European elites, not the European people. And some of these people are getting hurt very badly from all the sanctions, from whether it's Nord Stream 2 in Germany. A lot of people are paying higher gas prices. So I think this would actually make Europe a lot more peaceful if they had elections for a lot of their institutions. And that might be something interesting. As for the only other thing I'd like to say is, besides participating in April 12th and April 25th, because I really would like to honor my relatives, the last thing I want to say is that we have not talked about what I think is the most important issue, which is the New START Treaty of 2010 is expiring in 2026. Putin suspended Russia's cooperation, so obviously when the war ends, when it hopefully will end this year, they're going to have to find a way to get maybe extended 5 years at best, but probably find a way to continue the inspection and verification measures between these arsenals. I think that's really a huge issue to talk about as well, maybe in the next couple of sessions. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good proposition. Do we have time for maybe one or two more questions if they're short and if they're pressing? Does anybody in the audience have something that they want to get off their chest to share as a thought or pose a question to one of our speakers or all of our speakers? Okay, well, we've had Cree Energy. Okay, there we are. Cree Energy.
Hi there.
Hey.
Jacob Hiller here again. Yeah, just real excited to be participating in this. I'm sorry I was late today. But yeah, have you guys, I know, Matt, you were talking earlier or later last year about the ability of uniting businesses and actually starting instead of just talking, but actually getting businesses involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. What are you thinking about that? I'm done. That's my question.
Yeah, we absolutely are very enthusiastic about that, but I get that, and Ed might have a word to say about that. I think that we need some political decisions to be made to create a climate in which those sorts of relationships and business relationships won't be sabotaged through secondary, tertiary sanctions and other things. I know Mark Carney just put out a very aggressive statement that any chance of Canada cooperating on anything with Russia in the Arctic is off the table and will never happen in his mind, as long as he's in the position of Viscount of Canada. So if you've got toxic political climates like that, sure enough, there won't be any way that businesses will be able to go solo. Unfortunately, but if you can get some honest, authentic discussion, as Ed was alluding to, some real trust building measures where, let's say, Trump could appear with Putin and Xi, and sign some bilateral agreements, then a climate in which a lot of business contacts could start getting work done would happen super quickly. And we saw that with FDR and his efforts to expand an international New Deal as the basis upon which any type of durable peace could occur would be through investing in projects that would uplift people and create good business and profit for those who were able to make it happen. So that's something that was sabotaged because the empire knows that things like the Belt and Road Initiative, like the Polar Silk Road, actually works. It works every time that sort of thing is done. So my thinking is always, look at what the enemy is afraid of and do more of that. But that's my approach. I don't know, Ed, would you have anything to add to that?
Well, I just wrote recently an article that just Robert mentioned, and it was originally published by Anti-War when I talked about expanding cooperation in Arctic, and then plurality, of course, picked it up, American Thinker. So total readership was over 10 million clicks, and I got a lot of responses, some positive responses. And so hopefully from all those responses, something will come. First, you come words, and then we have deeds. I also have some hope for new Russian ambassador, Alexander Darchev. He just arrived to Washington, and he used to be ambassador in Canada. He has a lot of, I assume, Canadian contacts, and he understands Canadian scenery. And so I'm waiting for, probably he needs a few days to accommodate, and he has pile of problems. But I expect to see him and see what his role can be in this case. But first, for this Murmansk event, tremendously positive effect so far on general public. And I think the business is waiting for the big guys. So it's still coming back to this important May 9 day and April 5, of course, and see if Trump will make history, not by starting another war, but making peace. So we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay, it looks like we are through for today. And the next time we have very good speakers who are well known. I'll send you information about them. It will be what, April 13, right?
I think so.
April 13.
Yeah.
Right. But before that, we'll have something on April 12, Space Day, and then April 25. So we have many things ahead of us. Thank you so much for joining today. And it's always a pleasure to start Sunday and next 2 weeks. Give us some hope, not despair.
All right. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everybody. Till next in 2 weeks' time.